Hello class. Okay, so today we are covering ethical egoism, okay? And we're looking at a textbook by McKinnon and Fiala that this summer I found by way of a PDF. So it's making it a lot more accessible for us to read this, which is fantastic because I've always just relied on scanned copies for the book. So yes, so thankfully we have a PDF and we're looking at chapter 4, Egoism, Altruism, and the Social Contract, okay? And so now, whenever we're looking at ethical egoism, we see this as a meta-ethical position. And the best way to put this in an uncomplicated way is to suggest that there's so many problems with the theory of ethical egoism that it doesn't stand as a normative theory on its own. So as a result, because of these contradictions and problems that ethical egoism has, we refer to it as a meta-ethical position. In other words, we're basically calling into question whether or not it could even be thought of as a theory to begin with, and that's basically the way in which we study ethical egoism, okay? So with ethical egoism, we understand that it is often contrasted with ethical altruism, okay? So then what does ethical altruism mean? So altruism has to do with a concern mostly for the well-being of others. So an altruist is one who is concerned mostly with the well-being of others, okay? So you want to avoid personification here. And so also, whereas ethical egoists, and here, by the way, this is the easiest way to write about ethical egoism, is to refer to someone who is practicing ethical egoism as an ethical egoist, right? And so just be warned, because McKinnon and Fiala do personify ethical egoism and other terms as we go along, so you want to be super careful, okay? So another point that's critical to discern right away is to recognize that there are two terms that must be made clear, okay? So we need to see that there's a difference between egoism and ethical egoism, okay? So the first, egoism, is a description and hence not normative, whereas the latter, ethical egoism, is normative and hence prescriptive, okay? So one is descriptive, egoism, the other is normative, which is ethical egoism, okay? So when we refer to egoism, we refer to a psychological claim, okay? A description that people in general are inclined to be self-interested, hence egoists, okay? So then when we refer to ethical egoism, we're referring to a normative claim that people should act on their own self-interests, okay? And if you're arguing as an altruist, then you'll appeal to the notion that people should not always and often act on their own self-interest, right? To then focus more for an altruist on the well-being of others. Okay, so if we're referring to egoism, we're also working at a description of a supposed fact, okay? A supposed empirical fact. So in this context, we're identifying egoism with a fact, okay? So it is a fact that people should be self-interested is what's presumed when we offer a claim that people are egoists, okay? So also too, as McKinnon and Fiala indicate, the behaviors of the altruist are leading to what we call pro-social behavior. That is to be acting on the behalf of others, okay? So leading us to a conclusion that an egoist probably is only acting on behalf of others, okay? While still doing so out of self-interest, right? Of which is not necessarily a pro-social behavior, right? And so this is a problem when we view altruists in conjunction with how it is that we understand egoism, right? That in other words, sometimes when we're looking at altruism from an egoistic perspective, we might even assume that when people act out of the interest of other people, that they're still doing so only by way of their an egoist position, okay? And that's problematic, right? So a problem arises with a description and prescription dichotomy, given that if we're working with a psychological and scientific conclusions, we see that it does help us to recognize that scientific studies with the obvious conclusion that cooperative behaviors are to be regarded as beneficial from an evolutionary standpoint, right? Our genes are likely to be widely distributed with more cooperation rather than not. Yet, before we get too comfy, we need to see this as establishing a fact, right? A scientific fact. Our ethical life, however, is not always governed simply by facts alone, right? The one way to take this into consideration is by way of freedom, okay? In other words, egoism is, in a descriptive sense, always deterministic. In other words, when we act egoistically, we do so beyond our own free will to do otherwise, right? When we rely on freedom, we do so beyond the way of considering ethical egoism is obviously in light of, sorry, I'm confusing this. Okay, so let's go back. So, in other words, okay, so we're talking about freedom. In other words, egoism is in a descriptive sense, is also deterministic, okay? In other words, when we act egoistically, we do so beyond our own free will. That is, if you're seeing egoism as deterministic, you're also seeing it as a description, and you're seeing it as a way to act that goes beyond just your free will, because then if you're saying that it's scientific, then you're saying it's a fact that people are self-interested, okay? But when we rely on freedom, we do so in a way that's considering ethical egoism in light of what we should do. And by extension, the ethical egoist's implication is that we should act in our own self-interest. So in other words, there's a difference between saying we act in our own self-interest, and then there's a difference also in saying that we should act in our own self-interest, okay? So in other words, one is deterministic, one is normative, okay? So because when one helps others, we risk closing our integrity and hence lessen our ability to help ourselves. So we're losing our integrity when we are helping others if we are taking on this implication that people act egoistically only by way of their self-interests, okay? So that's the problem of seeing ethical egoism in terms of altruism, right? So in bald terms, for the ethical egoist, it makes us weaker to help others and those in need. So for the ethical egoist, altruists enable weakness and likewise undermine the self-esteem of those in need. So that's the problem of altruism by way of the problem of ethical egoism, okay? So hence we find Ayn Rand, who was born in 1905 and died in 1982, so who founded the philosophical position of objectivism. So her ideas have had significant impact on contemporary politics, namely the conservative right, namely with the term libertarianism. So starting with Ron Paul and continuing with his son Rand Paul, serving as senator from Kentucky. And then there's also former Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. Okay, so here we find an affiliation with what's termed laissez-faire capitalism. And most generally, advocates of liberty, i.e. they're advocates of liberty and i.e. less government, less infringement on personal liberty and the like. Although libertarians do source their ideological roots even further back to thinkers like John Locke. Henry David Thoreau, etc. So Ayn Rand stands as a primary 20th century capitalist who's taken on libertarianism with her 1943 novel, The Fountainhead. Okay, so with objectivism as the forefront of her philosophy, right? Proponents of this mindset proponents are of the mindset that as ethical egoists, we must not only embrace productive work in a capitalist sense of the word, so as to fulfill our self-interest and to fuel our productivity, et cetera, with as little government regulation as possible, hence laissez-faire capitalism of the libertarian, and then also of Ayn Rand's philosophy known as objectivism. Okay, so Rand was stridently anti-altruistic, given that she believed that setting aside our own self-interest toward the interest of others is problematic, right? Such a sacrifice lessens our ability to work, trade, and produce things in the name of my self-interest, my ethical egoism. So altruism is thus a compromise, and in this framework of ethical egoism, right, and often is thought of as secondary, okay? Others then are also then secondary to one's own self-interest in this capitalist libertarian mindset, okay? And in that sense, that's where we could find criticism with the theory. So I'm thinking we've already showed that psychological egoism is scientifically fact-based way of seeing to and accounting for our ethical behavior. So psychological egoism is also understood as egoism itself as well. So we have psychological egoism and egoism. Those two terms are tied together because they're descriptive and scientific. Then we have ethical egoism, which is understood as a normative claim, okay? And ethical egoism as a normative claim is also a challenge to altruism, okay? And the problems of altruism for the egoist is that isn't it better to look out for my own self-interest than the interest of others? And we can be critical of that because we could basically assert that, well, if it's a normative claim, then we should be this way, but we don't always have to be that way, okay? So it's easy to see that under the term psychological egoism, we find the extending of the egoist in the problem of highlighting the issue of helping others with the primary goal of really just fulfilling our own self-interest, right? Which is always the case, yet as we'll explain in a few, there are more problems with this descriptive account once we identify weakness of the will with the term akrasia. Okay, so we have this term akrasia, which basically is an ancient Greek word having to do with a challenge, which is a challenge to psychological egoism, which basically means weakness of will. So akrasia basically means weakness of will, and the idea of the weak will serves as a challenge to the psychological egoist. That's to see that even if I have the desire to do something in my own self-interest, I might not always account for the way in which I have a weakness in my will to see a goal to its end, okay? So hence, the phenomena of akrasia stands in contradiction to the aims of the psychological egoist. So again, psychological egoism is a descriptive claim, and we could start poking holes in it by seeing that, well, if we take into account weakness of the will, people are not always able to accomplish what they want for themselves simply because they are not always able to do everything that they want because they have weakness of the will. They have akrasia, okay? So yet another challenge to psychological egoism is sourced by way of one's intent, okay? A psychological egoist often claims that we universally act on our own self-interest, okay? So, yet, here again, we're not wholly accounting for free will to do otherwise. Because once we say that it's a descriptive claim, it's a scientific claim, that we are all egoists, then we are nullifying the idea of free will because we are suggesting that we can't do otherwise. If we're saying, well, we're all naturally predisposed to being egoists, which is a claim when we're saying that it's a descriptive account of how it is that we understand who we are naturally as psychological egoists, et cetera, et cetera. So, i.e., the free will to act not only by way of my own self-interest. I don't always have to act by way of my own self-interest. We know this in a normative sense because we account for freedom, right? If we're free to do otherwise, we're not necessarily restricted to the claim that we're naturally or inherently always acting as self-interested egoists. So in other words, the idea of free will then pokes another hole in the problem of psychological egoism, which again is a challenge to the reason why we can't comfortably say that ethical egoism is a foolproof theory. Because we're seeing that the normative problems with it are such that, well, we can act in someone else's self-interest. We don't always act in our own self-interest, so on and so forth. Okay, so essentially, these are ways to question the factual nature of egoism, to challenge it as a given of our nature. So the utilitarian ethicist Henry Sidgwick, who was born in 1838 and died in looks like 1900, as described by McKinnon and Fiala in the text, highlights what's referred to as the paradox of hedonism, as the impulse towards pleasure, if too predominant, defeats its own aim. So that's the paradox of hedonism. In other words, if we're aiming toward pleasure, then we have the problem, especially in terms of getting what we want, then we have the problem that we don't always get what we want, and we don't always have pleasure when we are aiming for everything that we want. So hence we have the so-called paradox of hedonism by way of Sidgwick, right? So it's easy to suggest that if we aim for pleasure, we'll get it. Yet there's no guarantee that every time we seek pleasure, pleasure always follows, right? That's the paradox. We don't always get what we want. And sometimes paradoxically, the exercise and pursuits of pleasure often brings about a lot of pain, right? And so given that we could see that the pursuit of pleasure brings a lot of pain to an ethical egoist, we could then suggest that pursuing what you want all the time isn't always going to get you what you want. So therefore, there's another problem or paradox in light of seeing ethical egoism as a foolproof ethical theory. Okay, so right, so as McKinnon and Fiala indicate in their subchapter on considering the consistency and coherence of ethical egoism, we easily see problems with the idea that ethical egoism must be based on a supposed fact of psychological egoism, right? With the observation that if I'm an advocate of ethical egoism, then I'm thinking everyone should pursue their own self-interest, right? But that's an impossibility, right? Simply due to the fact that if everyone only aimed for their own self-interest, my self-interest would have to be compromised and hence not fulfilled at all times due to the overlapping of others' self-interest that will get in my way, and likewise my self-interest will get in the way of others' self-interest. So there's then conflict and hence contradiction to the idea that everyone should aim for everything that they want, okay? So while getting in the way of my own self-interest to the degree that we couldn't rightfully suggest this as a moral prescription, okay? So hence, it's not a viable moral theory, right? So one interesting example of the problems of believing that egoism is a mere fact is referenced with the game theory of the prisoner's dilemma with this, and I have the chart, okay, the diagram posted on our announcement, okay? So in other words, law enforcement has two suspects, X and Y. The suspects are separately offered the following deal. If you betray the other suspect, you will go free instead of getting a 20-year prison term. But if you both betray each other, you'll both end up with a 10-year sentence, okay? If both keep their mouths shut, then they'll both walk free. Okay, so the long story short is that looking at the way it plays out, the assumption of betrayal is the riskiest move, right? And this carries the strong message that betrayal is tied to the assumption that the other person will do the same to you, right? Whereas a more trusting position yields the better result, and also carries with it the implication we shouldn't always assume that people are only motivated by their own self-interest, right? Such ethical egoist problems are also behind how it is that we understand social and economic policies as well, right? So hence, this is where we find the 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who was born in 1588, died in 1679. In his 1651 book, Leviathan. So we find an early example of social contract theory, whereby Hobbes believed that essentially we're all, quote, nasty, brutish, and short. That is, we're all psychological egoists, okay? So at best. So once we take this as a given, we must work with the idea that even though we're self-interested egoists to begin with, then we need to work out of our social and economic governmental policies with our social contracts to ensure that promises are kept. In other words, the way in which we lay down our social policies, et cetera, are to counteract this claim that somehow we're all ethical egoists, so on and so forth, and that the social contracts are there to ensure that promises are kept and cooperation is ensured, okay? So for Hobbes, the social contract is an agreement to give up certain things to better secure one's self-interest, right? So in other words, there still is a compromise that has to happen or a sacrifice. So for Hobbes, this is where we need a sovereign or a figurehead to keep this in place, whether that's in the form of the people or a literal figurehead by way of the monarchy. So interestingly, the people could also be thought of as a whole as having sovereign rights unto themselves. Okay, so this stops us at page 75 of the text, and that's where I'll stop on social contract theory and some of the contradictions of psychological egoism in contrast to ethical altruism, and likewise seeing this as problematic as a normative theory on the whole, given the contradictions and paradoxes that we pointed out. So thank you, and we'll talk more about this later.